Hi, it's me, Igor and I'm back for the final and 8th lesson, Play like an endgame expert. In this lesson, I will show you how to apply the correct system of thinking in a practical gameplay. You will see how you can think like an endgame expert. We can see a very standard endgame position. It's equal, and I guess that a lot of players would probably agree to a draw here. An endgame expert would never do it. He knows that at least he should taunt his opponent and use all the possible resources first. Most players don't understand an endgame well enough. They make a lot of mistakes, and that's why you can often win even a totally equal position. White played king f2. In the endgame, according to the principle of the least active piece, you should bring a king into the center. King f8, king e3, knight c6. Okay, now it's time for white to compose a plan. We know two main endgame plans. You can move your passed pawns or attack the opponent's weak pawns. White has no passed pawns and no possibility to create them. Therefore, the only thing white can do is to attack the opponent's weak pawns. Next, we should figure out the exact targets for our attack. Mostly you should look at the pawns which are not protected by other pawns. In this position, black has the backward pawns b7 and f7. So white should attack them. However, these pawns are very close to the black's position and it's difficult to attack them practically. If white tries to play, let's say, knight e4 to try to jump to the d6 or to the c5, black will easily stop it after king e7. Now, knight c5 doesn't work because of knight king d6, therefore knight e4 doesn't do much. If you can't attack the opponent's pawns right now, it means that you should weaken them first. That's why white should play f5. Now black needs to take a decision. Certainly it's bad to take. It will break his pawn structure and white will easily attack it then. For example, after bishop takes and knight takes. White is taking the pawn right now. It seems like white is winning this pawn after h5, knight g3, h4 and knight f5. By the way, you can see that white is always trying to attack the opponent's weak pawns. Okay, let's go back. What else black can do now? He can play g5. After that, white should definitely play f6. It fixes the black's weaknesses, and it's great when you can do it. It gives you great chances for a successful attack. Moreover, white has to play f6, otherwise black will play f6, then king e7, and it's a fortress. If white can't realize his only aggressive plan, it means that white can't do anything at all. After f6, white will then play knight f5 or bishop f5 and will attack the h6 pawn. Probably this position is winning for white already. Do you know why it happened? It's because black played g5. A defender should be very careful with pawn moves in an endgame. Pawn advancement is the most common mistake of players in an endgame. Okay, in the game black played the correct move king g7. Black protects the pawn and avoids a pawn move. What should white do then? Of course, white should think how to attack the black's pawns. F takes, f takes. Now black has the new weak pawn on g6. This pawn is closer to the white's territory. That's why it's simpler for white to attack the g6 pawn than the f7 pawn. Okay, so black has the weak pawns b7 and g6. These are the pawns which are not protected by other pawns. Here we come to the second step of planning. White should think how to use his pieces to attack these weaknesses. The white's king will go forward to the e4 and to the d5. The king works great with pawns, so we can try to bring the king to c7 or to the b6 in the future. And certainly it will be great for white. The bishop should be placed on e4, In the center, the bishop is very powerful and is controlling the whole board. In this position from the e4, the bishop will attack the g6 weakness and the b7 weakness, so really it's an ideal position for the bishop. The knight will go to e4 and then to d6 or to the c5 to attack the b7 weakness. White shouldn't move pawns here. Remember, we should avoid unnecessary pawn moves in an endgame. Okay, we have finished with the planning. We know what to attack and how to do it. Certainly it's very simple to play red moves when you have a clear plan. Thus white has 3 candidate moves: king e4, bishop e4 or knight e4. King e4 doesn't work because black can answer bishop e6 and the king can't go forward. Bishop e4 is interesting, but it takes up the knight square. After bishop d7, for example, white can't make any active move here. Therefore, white should play knight e4. You can see that in an endgame you should think rather generally. The calculations are very little and simple. The planning becomes the most important thing, and it's important to develop your schematic thinking. You should think where to place your pieces and which position you are going to create. White is threatening knight d6 at the moment. What will black do? He can play bishop f5, but in this case white will play g4 with a big pleasure. A bishop is much stronger than a knight in an endgame, especially in positions where you can play on both flanks. This is often a decisive advantage. After bishop takes e4, white can take by the bishop or by the king and then bring it to the c7. It should be easily winning for white. Okay, let's go back. Black played b6 in the game. It's a little achievement for white because every opponent's pawn move weakens his position. Now white has the only active move, knight d6, bishop d7. What should white play now? The white's plan is to attack the black's weak pawns. Of course he should try to attack his pawns first of all, knight c4. It's the only attacking move, and it provokes black to move his pawn again and to weaken it even more. Black played b5. In the future, the white's king will be able to go to the c5 or to the b6 very quickly. The advanced pawns are good for an attack, but bad for defense. Knight d6, g5. It's not a pawn move. After every opponent's pawn move, you should say to yourself, "Wow, he is moving a pawn and is weakening his position. How can I attack his new weaknesses?" After g5, white can play knight f5 check to attack the new weakness on the h6. Of course, we will be happy if black exchanges the bishop on a knight. It will give white a decisive material advantage. That's why black played king g6. Though it looks dangerous, but it's the only move. A discovered check doesn't give anything for white because black will simply play king f6. So what should white do? The white's plan is still the same, to attack the black's weak pawns. The weak pawns are h6 and a6. White can't attack them right now because his pieces are not very active. The knight f5 is good, but the bishop and the king are still passive. We intended to put the bishop on e4 and to move the king forward. The king can't go forward right now, but bishop e4 is possible and white should play it. After bishop takes f5 and bishop takes c6, the white's king will go to b6 quickly, and it will be easily winning for white. It's really a very powerful idea to bring your king to the opponent's pawns. Often it just wins, and this position is not an exception. By the way, if we imagine the same position with the black's pawn on b6 instead of b5, that would be a simple draw. You see how it is important to provoke an opponent to advance his pawns. Okay, let's go back. In the game, black played knight d8 here. White answered g4. It's protecting the knight and is fixing the weak pawn h6. An attacker's side usually may and even should move pawns in an endgame. a5. Black made another unnecessary pawn move. It's great. Now white can easily attack the new weaknesses after king d4 and c5. So white played king d4, knight e6 check, king e5. Usually you should keep your pieces closer to each other to make them more harmonic. Knight f4. Black is going to take the pawn, and of course white should prevent it. In an endgame you should collect stable positional advantages, and certainly you shouldn't lose them. h4. It's important to mention that white is not going to trade the pawns. An attacker's side should save pawns and avoid exchanges. Okay, now white wants to play h5 and totally fix the h6 weakness. This will be just great for white. That's why black took. Bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5. White got material advantage. The bishop is much stronger than a knight in such positions. King f7. Okay, the position has been changed, so let's think about planning again. White is going to attack the black's weak pawns on the king side and on the queen side. The white's king is very active and can go to the black's queenside pawns. The white's bishop can play on both flanks, while the knight can be active only on one side. It also gives white a great advantage. The white's bishop can't attack the black's pawns right now, so we may leave it on f5 or place it on the central square on the e4. Therefore, white should bring the king to c5 now. However, white played a3 first. I like this move very much. You know that a defender should trade pawns in an endgame. That's why black will probably try to play a4. Now let's try to imagine this situation. Instead of a3, let's say white would play bishop e4. a4. Yes, white can avoid exchange and play b4 here, but after that black will play a3. The situation will be more unclear. Perhaps it will be winning for white anyway. However, in an endgame we should restrict an opponent's counterplay. You can win a game without any counter chances from the side of an opponent. To restrict an opponent's counterplay, you should prepare a realization of your plan as good as you can. That's why in the game white first played a3. It's an instructive idea and you should remember it. To avoid pawn exchanges, you should create a symmetric pawn structure. Now if black plays a4, white will answer b4. If black plays b4, white will answer a4. Thus there is nothing black can do. In the game black just played king e7. Bishop e4. White centralized the bishop. White still doesn't hurry up with the realization of his plan. It's very typical for an endgame. Knight e2. Now the h4 pawn is hanging. Normally an attacker should avoid pawn exchanges, but in this position white should take because he can easily attack the g4 pawn after that. So white took, h takes. White can't play king f5 now because of knight g3 fork. Also white can't play king d5 because of knight c3 fork. Thus white should replace the bishop first. Bishop d3, knight c1, bishop c2. Of course white should avoid pawn exchanges. Knight e2. Black is using tactics again. White can't play king f5 because of knight d4 fork. However, white can go to the queenside pawns. King d5, knight f4, king c6, and knight e6. Black is threatening knight d4 again. I hope that you printed the mind maps from the previous lesson. Now you can take a look at it and you'll see that a knight creates tactical motifs in an endgame. However, it can change the general situation because the stable factors are more important in an endgame. White just played bishop d1, b4. It's an interesting position now. What would you play here as white? Most players would take the pawn and play king b5 then. Those winning a pawn is a fundamental mistake. It trades the pawns and gives black some chances for a draw. An attacker should not exchange the pawns but win them. An endgame expert would definitely play a4 here. After that he will play king b6 and will win both black pawns. You can see again a great difference between an endgame master and an ordinary player. White really played a4 in the game. There followed knight d4 check, king c5. White wants to push away the knight first. By the way, you may pay attention to another instructive idea. There are two squares between a bishop and a knight, and it restricts the knight's activity greatly. Knight e6, king b6, king takes a5, and king c5. When stable positional factors change, you need to correct your plan. It's a very important idea. You may not think about planning all the time because of a time consuming, so you need to know when you should think about planning. By the way, the stable positional factors are material and the pawn structure. So again, when stable positional factors change, you need to correct your plan. White won a pawn, and now he needs to think about planning again. Here we go. There are two main endgame plans. You can move your passed pawns or attack opponent's weak pawns. In this position, white has a passed pawn a4, and white certainly should advance it. First, white needs to play king a6 and b7 to free the a-file. Black has the weak pawns b4 and g5. White can't attack the b4 pawn anymore, but the g5 pawn is a real target. White can transfer the king to the king side and attack this pawn. If you can realize both of the endgame plans, you should do it. This will help you to stretch an opponent's defense, the principle of two weaknesses. So white should really realize both of these plans. Now we come to the second step of planning. How to use your pieces to realize the plan. The king will go to b7. It will support the a pawn or will go to the g5 pawn. The bishop is a bit passive at the moment. Is there any better square for a bishop? Yes, it can be replaced on the c4. Now we know the exact plan, and white will just realize it. Bishop e2, the bishop is going on c4, knight d4, bishop c4, knight c6, knight b8 check, king b7, knight c6. White can't push the a pawn now, so white should attack the g5 pawn, king c7. The king is going to f6. Knight a5, bishop e6, knight c6, king d7, knight a5, king e7. Here you can see a knight's weakness clearly. It can control only one side. So white is tearing the black's defense, and that's why black can't keep his position. King d4. In the game, white played king d6 here, which is enough for a win. Let's analyze the king f6 move, however. It's more logical and more instructive. Then king c3, king takes g5, knight takes b3, king f6. These are just the obvious moves. It certainly makes no sense for white to take the knight. Bishop is stronger generally, also a bishop works well with pawns. That's why a bishop is a very suitable piece to stop opponents' passed pawns and to support your pawns. Knight c5, and black needs to free his b-pawn, and now black is attacking the bishop. So white needs to save the bishop, bishop f7, b3, bishop takes, and king takes b3. Now we can see another weakness of a knight. It struggles against flank pawns badly. g5, white certainly should move his pawns. Black can play knight d7 or knight e4 here to try to stop the g-pawn. Knight d7 check loses easily after king f5 and then after king takes a4 g6. The knight can't stop the pawn. Let's go back. Knight e4 doesn't help either. After king e5, knight takes g5 and a5, the knight can't stop another side pawn. For example, after knight f7 check, king d5, knight d8 and a6, the pawn can't be stopped. I'd like you to make a few useful conclusions. First, an endgame is not a draw and it's much more interesting than most players think. Next, most players don't understand an endgame, and that's why you can and you should play even totally equal endgames until the end. There is a good chance that your opponent will start making mistakes and you will win. Next, you can become an endgame expert. This course will help you with that. In this lesson, I have showed you how exactly a grandmaster thinks in an endgame. You see, there is no magic here. Everything is quite simple and logical. All the necessary information is presented in this course. You only need to study it and to follow these recommendations. In the end, I'd like to tell you one more reason why it is so useful to be an endgame expert. In an endgame, you have no risk. That's why experienced players like to play an endgame against weaker opponents. In an opening, your opponent can use his preparation. In a middle game stage, you can miscalculate or make a sudden blunder. In an endgame, your strategic understanding matters the most. The one with better understanding will win the game. That's why you have no risk here. If you are stronger, you will win. In an endgame, you may also not worry so much about the time factor. When you are in a time trouble in the middle game position, it can be really hard. In an endgame, you have more simple position and you can play quickly without any problems. Next, a majority of modern players play in an attacking style. Those guys can't play the endgame at all. They continue going forward, moving the pawns and attacking your king. So they do the opposite things to what should be played in an endgame. In an endgame, you can beat them easily and without any risk. Thanks for your attention. Now you should go to the practical part of the course. Hone your endgame skills and show the chess world what you have learned.